Good evening. My name is Maria Zaitseva, and I'm producer of the regional program at Strelka Institute. Today, we are discussing urban planning as part of the program Urban Practices Online. Please welcome our experts, Alexandra Chechetkina, Strelka KB project director and curator of the Architects RF program, and Guy Perry, vice president of urban planning and design at McKinsey Company, Dubai. We are going to discuss how pandemic will affect urban development strategies. If you have any questions for the speakers, you can ask them in the broadcast chat. Our speakers will answer them during the sessions. The health of the citizens depends on the environment in which they live. It leads us to the first questions. What did the pandemic teach us? What requirements must be set in the urban environment? Alexandra, Guy, please.
Thank you very much. Introduction. Well, that's a huge topic. I think many people are now thinking about this and not yet had enough time to reflect on how the pandemic actually influenced our cities. But maybe, do you think, should we start with maybe introducing from where we are talking actually, because it's cross-countryal discussion today, quite international. Tell us where you are, and maybe I will introduce also how the situation is in Moscow, just to start with.
Well, I think it's a very good question. Everything is, as you said, relative. I am based here in Dubai, but I work all over the world. Right now, I'm pretty much locked down in Dubai, but things are opening up a little bit. I think when we look at cities and their impact on health, and whether it's COVID or during, shall we say, more normal times, we have to look at the city as a habitat. We can't look at it just as something that is based on engineering. It is something that has to be shaped for people. When it's not shaped for people, you end up creating an environment where people are actually more vulnerable. So, of course, and I think we'll discuss a little bit later, issues of density, etc. But my first criteria is whether cities actually encourage you to be healthy in the first place. Are they places that reduce your chances of NCDs, for example, whether it's obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, etc.? Those people we know are the ones, those that are affected by those NCDs are the ones that are actually most impacted by COVID. Pretty much anyone can get COVID, but the statistics in terms of those that are severely impacted by COVID are much higher for those that have those NCDs. So if we take an example of the New York hospital statistics from a few weeks ago, 88% of the people who died from COVID-19 actually had 2 NCDs. So in other words, they were obese and they had diabetes, or they had diabetes and they had cancer. So they actually had 2 NCDs. The challenge is that cities can either make us more prone to NCDs or less so, depending on the life patterns that they engender. So for me, the city is a bit of a gym, and it's a place where you shouldn't have to go to the gym to stay fit, depending on your life pattern. So I guess the first step I would take before I would start to criticize the risks of density, there are risks associated with density, I would also, in a sense, first look at, are these cities places that help you be healthy and resilient to begin with? And even within the same metropolitan area, we have very different statistics in terms of health. And we can delve into that deeper if you would like later in our conversation. I can take an example of a metropolitan area that I think we all know and describe how different parts of that city have very different effects on people's health statistics.
I would like really to support you on that, because according to the World Health Organization, it's about 15 or 20% only are the diseases which are genetic, and all the rest are actually caused by epigenetic factors. So probably caused by conditions, so by the way of life, the scenario of life people have in theirs. But also, well, yeah, let's discuss this issue of density, or maybe not even density, but crowding of people. Because, for example, on the south of Russia, there are many settlements which have very low density, but natural code is so people live in big families and they're hugely. So actually, COVID affected those areas where where there is a big population density, not necessarily the built environment. So we're here talking Moscow, where a few days ago all the restrictions connected to the kind of COVID were eased, and now we all can go back to the streets. But before, we experienced 3 months of quite tough self-isolation rules, where people actually started to look more at what environments, residential environments they are in. They take more focus on their apartments and buildings, because that's the way where they spend most of their time in the past 3 months. What do you think in regards to the personal spaces of people and general of this balance of private and collective and public spaces in the city? On the one hand, I've always been talking that it's very important to give possibilities for community to build their social relations, and that's why we need those kinds of spaces. On the other hand, we understand that they cause, in a way, this crowding, which also affects the kind of distribution of this of different viruses, of different infections in a more rapid way. Did pandemic actually change something in your perception of this topic, or there is another view on that?
Well, I think it's actually it's a very good question, because you have to enter into a different level of detail in terms of public space and the nature of the public space. So, for example, we know there's a significant difference between the transmission of the virus in outdoor spaces versus indoor spaces. So, indoor public spaces have a much higher transmission rate than outdoor public spaces. So, in other words, before we start abandoning creating a public realm of high quality, we should be thinking, okay, which are the higher risk public realms? Now, the higher risk public realms or semi-public realms would be indoor spaces with a high concentration of people. So something like an arena or a busy shopping mall or an airport that may or may not be very well ventilated. Those kinds of spaces where you have a lot of very close interaction in a contained space, unless you have truly an outstanding ventilation system, you are running a pretty high risk of being with a lot of other people in that space. Exterior spaces are a very different story, because you have the natural ventilation, you have the sunlight. All of these reduce the life of the aerosols that are one of the big issues with COVID-19. I'm working still very closely with my colleagues. I was teaching before at Hong Kong University. Of course, they had gone through the SARS epidemic, so we had a lot of data already about transmission in different kinds of spaces, different kinds of housing types. And clearly density does have some effect there, but also it's the kind of density that you're creating, which is probably the most important. So again, the public realm and places where people congregate, it's very much dependent on whether you're indoors, whether you're indoors in a very, very well ventilated place, or whether you're outdoors, and then also whether you're outdoors in a well ventilated place. Because you can also have places which capture aerosols outdoors, and you don't have the right movement to allow for the air circulation, which is really how you minimize your risk of being impacted by the COVID. So I would again just measure the kind of public space that you're creating. And while the tendency over the last decades had been to internalize a lot of these places, making them interior, I think we're going to see more of a shift towards creating higher quality outdoor spaces where people still can aggregate, congregate, because it's human nature. We're simply not going to survive as a species if we're not able to congregate, and but we will have to change the kind of places in which we do so, unless we find a vaccine. But this is not something that we can be certain of, and we're just not sure about the time horizon either. But I would even come back and say that whether or not we have a vaccine, we should be paying more attention to high quality outdoor space than we have over the last few decades. And luckily, and I've seen this in Moscow last year when I was there, you're working very effectively in the direction of creating higher quality outdoor spaces, whether it's the form of new parks, replacing enormous old hotels, or whether it's in the form of improving your streetscape, widening your sidewalks, which again creates a safer environment in which people can interact. So again, we can still get together, but we need to be careful about where we do so.
Right. And so if one of the components would be still the qualitative series and probably differentiated series of public spaces with the whole variety, which may kind of serve the different interests of different people and enhance social mix, would be one component of healthy city. What are the other components, to your opinion, which old concept city of well-being?
Okay, I'm not sure I caught all of that because the connection was breaking up a little bit, but other components of healthy cities, maybe this is a good time to talk about density and the nature of density. Hong Kong is a very dense city, as we know, but they were also able to, I think, for the time being, at least the first wave, they were able to contain the COVID, I think, very effectively. And that's in part because they had already gone through the SARS exercise. So they knew how to react. People knew that they need to have masks on, et cetera. So there was, in a sense, an awareness from the outset that people had to be cautious and act a certain way. Now, we still have to be very careful, I think, of buildings that really require you to share very confined public space. Things like elevators are a little bit of a challenge. And in some cases, they may be a significant challenge. But obviously, the whole notion of elevator capacity has been reevaluated over the last few months. Elevators that used to handle 16 people might only handle 4 or 6, for example, as a way of reducing the possibility of droplets contaminating others, or the density of aerosols that could accumulate. So this is one of the challenges of the high-rise building: is how do we create safer elevators? So whether you're going to be looking at ways of filtration, ultraviolet filtration systems, or much better ventilation systems in elevators as we go forward, whether we go towards low touch or no touch surfaces in the elevators, whether we look at copper or silver, which doesn't allow viruses to last nearly as long on surfaces. They're more expensive, of course, than what we use now. But we need to be looking at those kinds of confined places where people do have to interact with strangers very cautiously. And I would say that that is, when I look at, if I have to make density today, there's still a place for high rises, but with a certain amount of caution. But I really like buildings that you have the option to take a stair. And not just some fire stair that you feel like you're going in the back door, but where you take a stair with a certain quality, with a certain spaciousness, with possible natural ventilation, so some fenestrations, et cetera. Because ultimately that is going to be your safest bet in terms of moving vertically in a structure. But that's probably going to limit the height of your building to 6 or 7 levels. That's not to say you won't still have an elevator. It's just that I think that if you can get as many people as possible taking the stair, there's a double benefit. One is that you have less of a risk than in an elevator of being impacted by COVID, but you're also creating a healthier citizenship. In other words, the people using those stairs over time will certainly be healthier than those who are not. So, I have a case where I have a little apartment in Paris that's from several generations, and it's up on the fifth floor of the building. And I'm thinking, well, that's great. I always felt very healthy when I was living there because I'd have to go up and down the stairs all the time. But when you think about that, that is part of kind of resiliency. And I don't need to take an elevator to get into that apartment. And I'm very happy that that is actually the case now. So again, thinking about the stair in a different way, bringing it back as a key or even central feature to the vertical circulation of a building, I think is one of the ways that we can handle density, I would say, more safely. But a super high-rise building that's going to force you to pack a lot of people into elevators, they could be a challenging typology in the near term, at least.
So this is to talk about kind of architectural qualities within buildings. That's interesting you say about staircases, because recently in Strelka we have developed the new integrated guidelines for urban development of Russian cities, where there are kind of 10 books of material, how should the cities be kind of reviewed in terms of different architectural and planning solutions to react more to the human needs. And also there is one book with the typical architectural solutions, which actually state a very similar idea that at the moment in most Russian buildings, even those which are built now, we have staircases, but they usually serve as a technical kind of element of a building behind a metallic door, and not very friendly, actually, even visually, or it doesn't have really architectural quality. And some fire regulations, which we for some reason still have here, although there are many different ways to kind of cope with fire in more innovative way, actually allow us to work more for open staircases, which are kind of inviting, as you say, to walk on. And well, this is one point about architectural and spatial quality of a building. And if to talk more on a kind of strategic level, what interests us also is how this topic of health and well-being, and in which cities, if you know the good example, were brought on the table as the one and main topic on a strategic level that would actually force bigger solutions, maybe master plans, maybe spatial development plans. Of course, we can do some local things in our buildings and in the public spaces, which would kind of enhance a healthier well-being of people in these spaces. But if talk more strategically and more kind of on the level of general solutions which are taken by municipal government or even by national government, what do you think are the key kind of steps which need to be taken, and what are the good cases that you know at the moment who actually really work on this topic as a central one and driving force?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting perspective. There's some analysis that has been done on some cities, like in the U.S. There's a map that's come out which indicates which cities you're actually going to gain weight in and which cities you'll probably lose weight in as an average American, just because of the life patterns that they engender. As I mentioned before, you can even break it into districts within the same city. So a few years ago, I did some analysis of the Sydney metropolitan area in Australia, and it was very interesting to see that there were enormous disparities in health statistics depending on what part of the city you lived in. And it wasn't so much a distinction between rich and poor. It was more of what kind of life pattern did a different district from another support. So, for example, there's some districts near the center of the city, southeast of the center of Sydney, of downtown, where your obesity rates are about 14% of the population. There are other districts to the west of the city that you have an obesity rate of 39% of the population. Now, that's a huge gap. And if you drill down and you actually look at the different streets, what the streetscape is, what is the mixity of use in those different areas? The area where you had a 14% rate, you had very narrow streets, you had a lot of shade on the street, so they were very walkable. You didn't have a lot of parking, so you probably, if you had a car, you had to park some distance from where you were living to use it. You could walk to most of your services, including entertainment and basically any activity that you needed. Perhaps you had to go beyond your neighborhood for work, but other than that, you could do pretty much everything in your neighborhood. In the other example, in the western suburbs, you pretty much you had a series of homes with fences around them. There were no sidewalks. You had to go to a shopping mall every time you wanted to make a purchase. You had to go a significant distance to go to schools. And you probably had a pretty long commute to go to work, wherever that was, because there really weren't any workplaces in those areas. So basically, you had two very different environments. One that invited I would say, just naturally active lifestyle. And that didn't mean you needed to be an Olympic athlete. You just had to be physically active. So you would, without even knowing it, get those 10,000 steps in a day just by moving around to do your daily activities. And the other area where you were going to be pretty much pushed into a very sedentary life pattern for two reasons. One is that you were going to have to drive everywhere because everything was too far to walk to or even ride a bike. And the other was that you didn't have a sense of community or neighborhood. So you were probably going to spend a lot more time gaming and online, which is also a very sedentary activity. So when I look at what makes a city healthier, I don't just look at the life pattern in terms of our physical space. I also look at the way in which our time is occupied. So, for example, if we look at statistics on online time, a city like Tokyo, the average amount of time online is less than 4 hours a day. In many cities, American cities, Brazilian cities, you're actually looking at 7, 8, 9, 10 hours online a day. That is very sedentary time. So unless you're offsetting that consciously by making sure that once you're offline, you're really going to be physically active, you're going to have a tough time staying, keeping your metabolism in balance, in check. And it's very interesting because in Japan, they even have a law, which is, the nickname is the Metabo Law, which says that if more than a certain percentage of your workforce in a company has a waist circumference of more than, I think it works out to about 35 inches, you actually pay quite a heavy fine to the government. So you're actually required to keep your people fit. Now, luckily in Tokyo, that's a relatively easy thing to do because Tokyo, as a human-scaled habitat, is absolutely remarkable for a metropolitan area of 38 or so million people, in that it's almost like an enormous village, rather than being a kind of monumental city which is cut up with freeways and, in a sense, forcing you into vehicularized transport. So not only do you have an environment which supports a healthier lifestyle, you statistically have people spending less time online, which is, of course, a very, very sedentary activity. So if you're online and you're driving a lot, which is the case for many, I would say, many suburbs and many contemporary cities, whether it's North America, South America, here in the Middle East, it's going to be really hard to stay fit, to stay at equilibrium. So these are the kinds of statistics I look at. I really look at, what is a day in the life of people? And it's not just the physical planning. It is also, what are they actually doing? Are they stuck online for X number of hours a day? Whether it's for work, whether it's for leisure, it doesn't really matter, but it's not good for you if it's more than a certain amount of time. And if you're not offsetting it consciously so that you're finishing your work or you're finishing your gaming and you're going to get out and you're going to walk a few kilometers and you're going to do that with pleasure, fine, it'll offset. If you're not doing that, if you're getting into your car and you're going to drive a half hour or an hour to do the next thing, well, at some point it's going to catch up with you, and probably sooner rather than later.
So if to take into consideration those two factors that you just mentioned, being online for some time and then driving, or rather having walkable environment and some public transport maybe, or mixing, what are the healthier cities that you know, and what are the least healthy at the moment?
Well, yeah, Tokyo, as I mentioned, Tokyo is statistically a very healthy city. I mean, you have a life expectancy now that's averaging over 84 years, which is one of the highest in the world. I mean, you have some small exceptions like Monaco, et cetera, but those are distorted by income. You have other cities where you have actually very modest life expectancies. Many of the cities where I am here in the Middle East have relatively low life expectancies, given the wealth of these cities and these countries. What's remarkable is that the healthy life expectancy is considerably shorter as well. In other words, there's even a bigger gap in many of these cities, whether it's many of the North American cities or here where I am in the Middle East, where you have a big gap between healthy life expectancy and life expectancy. Now, life expectancy already isn't that great, but your healthy life expectancy is even shorter. And that's where it becomes also it becomes a public health crisis, because not only are people not living as long, but they're not living healthy as long. They may be able to stay alive for another 10, 11 years from the time when they've become unfit. But again, that is a challenge to themselves and to society. So in an optimal environment, you want people to stay as healthy as long as possible. And then, of course, you want them to live as long as possible as well. But that delta between the healthy life expectancy and the ultimate life expectancy, if you can also tighten that up, that's where you want to be going. So a city like Tokyo, very healthy statistically. Hong Kong is quite healthy statistically as well. These are cities where people basically are walking as a way of life. They're extraordinarily mixed-use cities. There's a lot of granularity in terms of the way communities are created and integrated. You have cities that are much more horizontally developed, that tend to have the more difficult statistics. So if I take the example of Sydney, those western suburbs of Sydney, which are basically what we would call urban sprawl, have very difficult health statistics. And we see the same thing in American cities. Those lower density single-use suburbs that have long commute times, statistically they fare much less well than the more compact cities that have more of a mixity of use and where people really are walking as part of their daily life pattern.
Yeah. So you actually named all the developed cities which are kind of being developed. The country also have some with developing countries and cities. Well, Russia, we are somewhere there at the moment. Have different issues which we have to still cope with to develop a city or a country. Do you think that strategy for healthy cities or cities of well-being, having all these patterns which you just named, is something is an overarching concept that should kind of be an umbrella for all the different concepts that different stakeholders use while developing theories, or the possible approach for these governments of these developing cities and countries to start thinking in this direction, to start implementing these solutions while they're still having a lot of issues with the basic kind of needs of people, including housing shortage, including low transportation connectivity and diversity, including low quality of public spaces, etc., etc., etc. Or you think it's step
Yeah.
by step, and maybe in 10, 20 years, we will come to this idea of thinking our cities in terms of health of people, physical and mental.
Very, very good and difficult question. I think that if we step back, I would say for the last few decades have been focusing more on the economics of city building. We've been focusing more on the infrastructure to integrate certain modern technologies, notably the automobile. And in a sense, we have an expression, we let the tail wag the dog. The city is first and foremost to serve people. Okay, if it's not serving people, if it's not a good habitat for people, then I'm not sure what we're building for. Okay, so yes, it's important that we focus on economic drivers, etc. But we can't do that at the expense of the well-being of a population. We have done that in certain times in our history, of course. But I think now, as we arrive to a stage, a post-industrial maturation stage, we need to, in a sense, be recalibrating. And frankly, COVID-19 is probably as good a time as any to really recalibrate and look at how do you make cities that make people more resilient to COVID-19 and perhaps the next COVID, which may be 24 or 28 or whatever it may be. So how do you implement that with existing cities? Again, I can look at the case of how central Moscow has evolved over the last decade or so, how they've really, I would say, humanized the city significantly by making the right choices about when there is the possibility of redeveloping an area in the city. Do you redevelop it or do you make a park in it? Do you look at rehabilitating buildings and making better streets out of what's there, or do you, in a sense, try to create something else, bulldoze it, make a big boulevard that would satisfy other notions of traffic than I think are most relevant today? If we look at what was done in Seoul, where they removed a freeway and they, in a sense, unearthed what was a creek that used to run through the city, and now that's become one of those most popular public parks in the city, and has created enormous value, and actually has reduced the traffic burden on the center of the city. If you give people the option to drive a place, they will, but that has all kinds of other consequences. So I think the key is to say, okay, well, where do I stand? What are my priorities? If my priorities are the well-being of people, then how I expand my city, how I retrofit my city needs to be focusing first on the outcome for people. Because today there are a lot of ways to make things work economically. There are a lot of ways to even make an industrial city that's very clean and very humane. So I think if we work with that perspective, we can actually end up with a city that is economically vibrant, and as importantly, perhaps more importantly, vibrant and healthy for its citizens. So I would say new projects need to incorporate these principles, what I call a human metric in the development, and the regeneration and redevelopment of cities needs to incorporate those principles as well. And again, you have good examples already in Moscow that I think are quite exemplary. Other European cities are very interesting. You know, what Paris is doing. Paris is, I think, really refocusing on making it a very human, very much a city focused on active mobility, as opposed to really allowing the motorized vehicles to enter the city and in a sense dictate the way in which you move around that environment. So I would say that is also a very good case study. But both Moscow and Paris are beautiful cities to begin with, and we're talking about the most beautiful parts of those cities. And really the challenge is going to be, how do we redevelop the peripheries of pretty much any major city in the world, what has been developed over the last 40 or 50 years. And that's where it would be very interesting to kind of reconsider the role of places like shopping malls, which are normally located on the peripheries of these cities and have been built over the last few decades, and think of them perhaps as an opportunity, because many of them will struggle. They've already struggled in North America and Western Europe. They've basically, there's a knockout blow, which is COVID-19 for many of them. We're going to see them struggling in other parts of the world increasingly. But if we were to say we still need that commercial activity in those parts of the city, but what if we were to integrate them into a much more mixed use environment? So it's not just about a commercial destination, but has many other elements that are often lacking in those new districts of the cities. And even if we look at the history in Russia or the Soviet, during the Soviet times, you had MicroRaions. You know them better than I do. And there was actually a lot of common sense in terms of the principles behind the MicroRayon. I'm not sure that they turned out as well as they should have, but I think that still many of the principles that everything was supposed to be within a certain area that you would typically need in a day was a sound one. Maybe the architectural expression was off register. Almost always the landscape expression was not where it needed to be, and the public realm was often an afterthought. But the point is that basic premise that you create an integrated environment needs to, I think, be reconsidered. And we can look at some of these places that may be struggling over the next decade or so, the shopping malls, et cetera, that have been developed over the last decades, that they can reinvent themselves to be something more complete and integrate more of the features that those districts of the cities need. And I think it would be a win-win situation, both in terms of the commercial value of those places, but also in terms of the quality of life of those neighborhoods.
There are 2 points in what you've just said, which I think lead us to another kind of set of questions, which we can discuss now. One is connected to the central city of Moscow changes, the recent changes. So we really worked on quite hard in the recent years, maybe 5 last years, to change the public environment, the public space environment here in the central city. And one of the direction was to pedestrianize the city, to lower amount of cars in the central city, but to provide more opportunities for people to commute via public transport or via bicycle infrastructure. It's a little bit still kind of not very well pushed forward, and also via pedestrian way. On the one hand, that was the main basis, the main principle, which worked for the city quite well. And now we can see after 5 years that it really worked well. On the other hand, we gained kind of the Moscow city really gained a lot of criticism in terms of this pedestrianization. Of course, all the some cities like London, where they also kind of change this way of thinking about transportation in the city. I think Ken Livingstone was the mayor who actually initiated that, and that was quite unpopular decision at that time, but still eventually worked very well for the city. But still now, according to the pandemic, in relation to the pandemic, people tend to say, and we have this question in the chat, that during this pandemic and during this time when people really crowd together, public transport begin to be a dangerous space and a zone where it's easier to get this disease. So in this moment, should we actually reflect on the way we use this public transport, or it's just a temporary thing which is now here and then it will go, but we still need to have more public transport, less private transport in the centers and in general in quite intense areas of our cities?
Very delicate question. Obviously, as cities have expanded, we need a certain amount of mechanized transport, whether that's common public transportation, whether it's private vehicles. Indeed, one of the big challenges that came out of COVID is that much of this infrastructure, and you have one of the most beautiful and effective subway systems in the world in Moscow, but it is a crowded environment, it is a contained environment. It's in a sense, it's like a very long elevator, right? I was criticizing or commenting on the risks associated with elevators. It's in a sense an elevator, but with many, many more people. I think that what they've done in Hong Kong is that they've reduced the capacity. In other words, they're not allowing as many people to use the public transportation, so the metro, the MTR in their case, at least initially. I'm not sure where they are now, where they've allowed it to go back to the original capacity. But I know that during the transition period, when there was still a significant risk of COVID infection, they did restrict the number of passengers. But in any case, that poses a challenge, that poses a threat, because you use these transportation facilities in order to really move a lot of people. So if they're not able to move as many people, it questions that as a primary means, indeed. Will we be able to continue to clean them to a level of sanitation, assuming that COVID stays with us? That's an open question. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is I come back to the premise I was mentioning before, is that if we can create a city where you're not required to travel long distances as often, you will, in a sense, be creating a safer city, because you'll be able to access most of your daily necessities within walking or biking distance. And then when you do have to take the transportation for the longer distance, a common public transportation, you'll hopefully be taking it with fewer people, because they will also be taking fewer trips. So I think that the idea here is that you recalibrate so that people are doing more things within their districts. And yes, they will sometimes have to travel longer distances, but we cannot assume that that public transportation will have the same capacity unless we are able to really control this COVID situation. And that, again, we don't know yet whether we will be able to. And we don't know if we're going to have another COVID in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, et cetera. My answer would also be that we should probably be looking at different forms of automobiles. In other words, reconsider the scale of the automobile, perhaps even consider that only certain types of automobiles be allowed into urban environments. So, for example, you have certain companies that are already studying. Toyota is studying. Renault has already come out with things like the Twizy, et cetera. Of course, they're the smart cars, et cetera. So you look at vehicles that are much more compact and thus much more easily integrated into the urban environment than everyone driving around in an SUV or a full-size vehicle. Because they really are difficult to handle in high-density contexts. And then, of course, you want to be looking at cleaner vehicles as we go forward. You may want to start restricting the kinds of vehicles that can enter into the center of a city. And you might even consider, before we have autonomous vehicles, because we don't know when we're going to have them, if ever, we can look at geofencing as an intermediate solution in terms of the security of vehicle movement vis-a-vis pedestrians and cyclists. I'm not a big fan of cycle paths, except on really major roads. But on small streets, there's really not usually room for a cycle path, because you end up compromising the pedestrian flows. You even create dangers for the pedestrians, because cyclists can move pretty fast, much faster than pedestrians. And I actually believe the best solution is to have the cyclist be part of the street, but that the vehicular traffic needs to be at a much lower speed. Now, we all know that it's almost impossible to control, but we have a historic example, which is we used to require, about 100 years ago, 90 years ago or so, 90 to 100 years ago, we used to require in America governors on any car that would enter a city. And a governor is something that doesn't allow your car to go above a certain speed. So the governor can be set at 50 kilometers an hour, it can be set at 30 kilometers an hour. So you are not allowed to enter the city of New York or Boston or Philadelphia without a governor on your vehicle, which basically said you're not going to be able to drive beyond a certain speed. Now, today we have a technology which has been actively used for golf carts since the 1990s, which is geofencing. And geofencing basically means through GPS, you're able to control the precise speed of a vehicle within a given area via satellite. And this is not an expensive device because most golf courses have them now. So it's not like something that a major city wouldn't be able to afford to implement. And it would be a minor cost for a vehicle to incorporate these. So, I mean, you could consider ensuring that any vehicle entering a city limit or coming off a freeway, because it can be done down to about a meter of accuracy, so that on the freeway you're geofenced at 100 kilometers an hour. But once you get off that freeway, off the ramp, into the city fabric, you can set it at 30 kilometers an hour. And no matter you have a 12-cylinder engine with 500 horsepower, you're still only going to be able to go 30 kilometers an hour, which is a reasonable speed to interact with cyclists and also minimizes the risk of conflict with pedestrians. So I would look at, if you're going to come back with the automobile as a key way of getting around the city, you have to look at it from two angles. One is the sustainability angle, or three angles. Sustainability angle, look at cleaner vehicles. The second is the spatial dimension, which is don't allow large vehicles back into the city. And the third is you need to control them in terms of how fast they can actually move through the city to ensure that people really feel safe about other forms of mobility, and notably active mobility. So I see those as kind of the three key elements.
Also, in accordance to the to some thought you said before in terms of MicroRaions, those actual neighborhoods from the 60s, which we have everywhere basically in each of the 1,117 cities of Russia. Those neighborhoods which were actually planned as this 15 minutes neighborhood, which I guess you were talking about, that area where
which
in a walkable distance you have whatever you need, just in a overcount distance, as they call it, just a rethought Clarence Perry diagram in a way. But it's quite interesting that those microraions we still have in the cities. The only thing which actually doesn't work today is that their planning unit, which tends to be something around 60 hectares, most of the case. It was not planned to have so many private cars parked in the inner territories, outdoors. So that moment, probably for a whole different discussion, what should we do with these areas in our cities in Russia?
Well,
but it's curious to hear that you give cities which cities or perceived healthy cities and if we talk density, 15 minutes neighbor, we talk about physical densities like average height, the number of floors, right of way, minimum, maximum, or open space ratio, like in Space Matrix, as they develop it into UDelft, or with physical density, the forest, the coverage, the street network, or social even density, the population density, dwelling, non-residential functions interests me much. For example, for some like Pioneer, Durang West residential complex, a neighborhood, and Pinnacle Duxton, they have quite high FARs, like something around 9 in terms of floor to area ratio, and they have quite low percentage area non-resident only with neighborhood in Stockholm in Sweden, the Hammarby, with quite a lower density, like up FAR, floor area ratio, and they have like more than 50% of non-function, so they kind of enhance this multifunctional experience. So talk that Hong Kong and Singapore are those cities which have this high density and thus have the possibility for people to be to live a pedestrian life in a way. Do you also have this consideration and probably the human scale as of being mentally comfortable in the, or what's relation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole density discussion, and the, I mean, for me, it's a balance between having a density which can still support a certain amount of activity within, whether you want to call it 10 minutes or 15 minutes, et cetera, but within a certain walking radius. You know, that there are many cities around the world now that are in densities that are at 1,000 people per square kilometer or 2,000, et cetera, where you can't really sustain those mixed use activities, mixed use neighborhoods, et cetera. And on the other hand, I'm not sure that in order for us to be sustainable and effective, we have to go to 40,000 or 50 or 60 or even 80,000, as in some neighborhoods in Hong Kong, as a kind of model density. By the way, Singapore is actually not that dense overall. And even if you look at Hong Kong and you include the mountains, which are, of course, very difficult to build upon, but they are effectively parks that people use for hiking, et cetera. It's actually not that dense either. Hong Kong, I think, works out to about 8,000 people per square kilometer. But that includes that green space, which is, again, more or less usable. So, and that's often something people forget, is that, yes, Hong Kong is dense, but within a kilometer or two of those kind of hyperdense areas, you also have areas that are completely decompressed, which are completely natural, or which may be an equestrian racetrack, which is right in the middle of a very dense area. So you have this balance between density and a kind of a natural relief. And Singapore is very much that way as well. So Singapore is conceived as much as a park as it is a city. So they're always looking at those two things in balance, in harmony, and I think that's the way one should look at cities. But climates are very different in different places. Culture is very different. So there's really no one size fits all. And I would say it's even very risky to say, okay, there's this formula that can work anywhere. Certain places are going to be more comfortable with lower densities. So certain places are going to be more comfortable with higher densities, but always, yeah, within certain limits. Because you go too low, there are almost no synergies. You may have a synergy with the land, you may be able to farm, et cetera, but then we're talking about a rural environment. In terms of going very dense, as I said, it's a double-edged sword now, because it's forcing us into proximities which we can't extract ourselves from. There's another statistic about high rises, which is an unfortunate one, and that is, and this I know from the time I was spending in Hong Kong and on the faculty there, is that there is a much higher proportion of diabetes, especially among children, in high-rise buildings than in low-rise buildings in Hong Kong. And that is simply because of the life pattern that those high-rise buildings engender. It's simply not possible to be taking your kids to get those 12,000 steps in a day, day after day after day. It is so much more tempting to hand them an iPad or whatever and let them entertain themselves that way than have to brave the waiting for the lift, et cetera. And of course, the constrained spaces, because Hong Kong is a very expensive city, means that people are they're not able to get the movement in that they need to be healthy individuals. Now, having said that, Hong Kong offsets by having 90% of the people, only 10% of the population driving to work. So people really are walking a lot once they exit their building. But the ones that are suffering the most in Hong Kong are the children, because they are not walking to work. They're not, taking necessarily the metro every day, and maybe they're going to a school nearby. Maybe they're being bused to a school. Usually they are bused to a school in Hong Kong. So they end up with an extraordinarily sedentary life pattern, which means that statistically Hong Kong may be a little bit more challenged in the future than it is today. So really depending on the kind of density you make, there's a whole matrix that you have to consider in terms of what is the right sweet spot. But in any case, I think you want to look for a mixity of uses, and you want people to simply walk those 10,000 steps a day without even knowing it. Just make it part of their daily life pattern and make it pleasurable. Don't make it something that people really dread because they're going to get a car or another, 2 or 3 cars, and that's exactly what you have in the MicroRaions now. One of the challenges post-COVID is that one of the solutions, in fact, Moscow was employing it very well, was this concept of shared cars. This is a bit of a challenge during the COVID era because you have to really worry about using an enclosed space, which you're not sure who is in that space 10 minutes before you're getting it. So that is a bit of a challenge because that was a very reasonable solution to the problem of the automobile in high density environments. And that could have been a solution for the MicroRayon to say, okay, you could have a pool of shared cars. This is what we were doing in Hong Kong. Because even though 90% of people were commuting with public transportation, there were certain places in Hong Kong you couldn't get with public transportation. So what we were looking at is that even though there's only one parking space for about 10 units in their case, we were looking at a pool of cars which would allow for people to use them as required. But again, now that we're questioning the sharing of these kinds of elements, the next solution I would say is if you need a vehicle, we need to be rescaling them for the future. The notion, a full-size vehicle that is usually only carrying one individual is a very 20th century concept. And even the modernists, the Le Corbusier, et cetera, the people who are quite close to many of the brilliant thinkers during the Soviet times, et cetera, they never imagined, and I know this because I was quite close to one of Le Corbusier's right hands, and they said, we loved the automobile, we thought it was wonderful, but we never imagined it would be one car per person. We just never imagined that would ever happen. And of course, the park in their projects, your MicroRaions, turned into the parking lot, as you said. And that, of course, is a travesty. So we'll never really know if those MicroRaions would have worked out as well as they could. But again, I think, to be honest, and having visited the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, those were not wonderful places. Okay, the buildings were not of good quality. The public space between them was not of good quality. So yes, the principles were good, but the execution was not where it needed to be for people to have a sense of what I would call pride of place, which is also very important for the creation of neighborhoods and getting people to want to engage their environments in a positive way.
That's interesting you say, because, well, of course, at the moment we look at these MicroRaions and ask what can we do with these buildings so they are actually having a better quality and actually probably more diversity of spaces that would meet the needs of different households, of different families. But just to be fair, I think in 60s there was a different question that solved but by this mass housing industrialization model.
Yeah.
The housing rate in the country, the general average housing rate in the country was so low. Now the UN says it needs to be 30 square meters per person, and back then it was around 7 square meters per person. So I told at BIT actually having grandparents. Actually, we calculated citizen of Russia actually live typical building. And back at them, it was a very big thing to get their own space, their own apartment, after being sharing apartments in Stalinist, mostly buildings, with some other families,
Sure.
or living 3 families in 3 rooms of an apartment. So
Right.
I think each moment of time has its challenge, and we are there to kind of reflect on that. So I think we are kind of having just a few minutes left, and maybe to sum up, I know when I've read the personal biography that you're also an architect, actually, an urban planner.
Yes.
In your background, right? So let's
At
maybe
heart,
try to
always.
answer the question in heart. Yes. What architects and urbanists, urban planners can do today to actually enhance this topic of healthy cities, of cities where people feel happy, of eudaimonia, as a topic in general? What could be our role in all of these processes? Because we have quite a big auditoria of architects and urbanists. Maybe should we try to give them kind of an advice or a thought that they could go for?
Well, first of all, I there should be more leadership positions when it comes to governance of cities, because they have a different perspective on um, what makes a city great, what in a sense affects people. And that's not to say there cannot be great mayors from other fields, but there have, I think, been some very interesting cases. If I look at one of our most interesting presidents, and I'm half American, half French, so I'll speak as an American now, was a fellow by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who was an architect, and he also became our 3rd president. But he was also the one who organized the entire Midwest. He set up a structure for us to develop effectively vast tracts of wilderness and create what is arguably one of the most efficient farming systems in the world. Had we not had an architect at that time, we probably would have a very different landscape with a very different level of efficiency in the United States today. And when we look at cities during a troubled period, during a transition period, you need people who understand the spatial dimension and the spatial dimension's effect on people, on citizens, in a very firsthand way. So whether they are the actual, whether they're the mayor or whether they're a deputy mayor, but their voice, I think, absolutely needs to be heard. I led the development of the largest private development in Europe this century so far, in Western, or EU, let's call it the EU. It was a district in Poland, the southern extension of Warsaw. And that project, I helped establish the framework with some of the old communist era planners, et cetera, who, by the way, had a lot of knowledge, a lot of good common sense. And then I made sure that virtually the entire project was done by many, many different local Polish architects. I didn't bring in rock stars from here and there, but rather I worked with the local architects, from which I learned a great deal, and I think they learned some from me as well. And we really orchestrated a neighborhood which became very attractive for investors, performed very well economically, but most importantly, when we aggregated all of their interventions in a harmonious way, we ultimately created a place that was not just safe, but where the average life expectancy today is 92 years, which is 12 years above the national average and considerably above the rest of the city of Warsaw. And that was because we stayed with a human metric. We allowed architects to really do very strong, very solid architecture, but not an architecture about spectacle, but an architecture that was really focused on what is it that people need. So within the same buildings, 250 square meter apartments, 40 square meter apartments. We mixed incomes. Some of the wealthiest people in the country and a music teacher, and they were in the same building. And it, I believe, is one of the reasons we have almost no crime. It is also one of the reasons that I believe that there's a kind of an extremely strong sense of community there, which makes this place a place where people feel that they are cared about by each other. And we know the two keys to longevity: physical activity, which I've talked a lot about today, but the other one has to do with feeling that you are socially engaged, that you are part of a community that is not just your family and proximity to your family, but your family being a larger community than just those that are related to you genetically. And we were able to achieve that because of the intervention of a lot of very good architects, who I would say many of them became better during the process of this development. And today I bring in the top developers from around the world. I show them that project and they say, wow, this is amazing. And I said, it was all done by locals. So I would really stress, work with the local architects, allow them to do quality work, but don't necessarily allow them to do big contiguous projects. Look at breaking down the scale. Maybe let an architect on a big project do 5 buildings, but don't let them be next to each other. And have them do a building next to someone they don't like at all, because they will get along, because what they're doing is going to be there for many, many generations. So they think differently than maybe what their personal differences can be day in, day out. We had exactly those cases on the big projects in Warsaw. They literally wouldn't talk to each other, but they would do great buildings together. And they shaped a community, which ultimately, for me, the proof of success was not that a lot of people made a lot of money, the Jerry Hineses, the Accionas, etc., but it was that people actually live a healthy and long life in that neighborhood. By the way, the obesity rate is almost non-existent for children in that neighborhood, in a country where the rate is quite significant now. So these are the things I look at, and architects play a central role in this, keeping in mind the human metrics. They can't go wrong. And be yourself. Don't try to be like something that's from another place. Do something that is about your own culture.
That's amazing what you have just said, because I think now we're in the frame of the program called Architects RF, stands for Russian Federation, with which we actually try to enhance this role of architects for leadership positions, for governing positions, exactly for the reasons you've just mentioned. So
Yeah.
thank you for stating this.
Right.
We will continue to work on this in our country, in our cities, and also very important thing, I think, which you just mentioned, is to work with local expertise and local competence and local knowledge to try to enhance all of that. As we know, more than 800 cities in Russia are shrinking. People tend to go to bigger cities. To live there, as they see that there are more opportunities and more interesting life and more kind of vital things that they find in other cities, bigger cities. Although creating those care environments and places of well-being is something very important to try to develop a more evenly dispersed built environment, but also healthy community and healthy social networks. So thank you very much for all the topics. I think there were many actually today which we tried to cover, but also the general topic of the discussion was kind of set quite in a broad way. So it's interesting that we actually mentioned several of them: housing, the components of health in cities, how governments tend to kind of govern these changes, and also the mobility. All of these are components which all architects, I think, not only those in leadership positions, but those who work in an even regular project in the city, need to think of when developing even one small building, which will be a part of a larger city fabric. It was very interesting. Thank you very much, and for the audience to be with us today.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, and good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay safe.
Yeah, thank you very much, Guy and Alexandra. It was really interesting. For our audience, you can find this session on Facebook, YouTube, Contacte, and other platforms. And you can find more information about our program on our website, Architectors RF. So thank you, and have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good evening.